The Admiral had seen countless wounds in his lifetime, burned scars from plasma fire, jagged marks from blades wielded in desperate boarding actions, even the disfiguring brands left by enemy interrogators, but nothing prepared him for the quiet shock that seized his chest when she moved so casually, so unthinkingly, lifting her shirt just enough to reveal the pale skin underneath, a gesture almost innocent in its lack of intent, until the light caught those lines etched into her flesh. They weren't the careless scars of a training mishap, nor the wild patterns of drunken violence. No, these were deliberate, methodical, carved into her ribs with such precision that they carried a story written in pain, a story that her lips had never spoken. The Admiral froze, every instinct honed from decades of command telling him to mask his reaction, to remain impassive, but his eyes betrayed him, lingering too long, caught between horror and reverence for the strength that must have carried her through such torment. She noticed the silence. She always noticed silence. For a moment, her smile faltered, not entirely gone but thinned at the edges, as though she'd expected this, as though she knew what those scars did to people when they first saw them. And then, slowly she let the shirt fall back into place, covering them once more as if she were pulling close the curtains of a window into another world, one she never meant to expose. But the Admiral could not unsee what had been revealed, could not shake the questions that thundered in his chest like a barrage of guns pounding in rhythm. She was younger than him by nearly 20 years, though battle had hardened her in ways that age could not measure, and in the months he had known her aboard his flagship, she had been a model of composure, wit, and resilience. Never once had she faltered in the face of duty, never once had she allowed the cracks of her past to show, until this moment, when an unguarded motion betrayed the existence of something far deeper than discipline could bury. He tried to speak, to ask her the simplest question, but the words turned to gravel in his throat. She saved him from the attempt. "I suppose you saw," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel, the kind forged not in academies or noble courts but in captivity, in darkness, in places where survival meant becoming less than human just long enough to remain alive. Her gaze did not waver from his, though it carried none of the warmth she usually offered in counsel or camaraderie. This was different. This was a challenge, the kind thrown down not on a battlefield but in the fragile space between two people where truth might be spoken or buried forever. He swallowed, finally managing words, though they came out low and uneven. "Who did that to you?" She gave a slight tilt of her head, a shadow of a smile touching her lips, but it was bitter, humorless, the kind of smile that mocked the question itself. "The same people you signed treaties with now," she replied, her eyes hardening. "The ones your fleet escorts through contested space while pretending we've achieved peace. They made sure I wouldn't forget them, and they made sure no one else would either, if I ever dared show skin where the sun could touch it." The Admiral's chest tightened. He had fought in those wars, commanded squadrons against those very same enemies, and though he knew the depths of their cruelty, he had never before seen its imprint carved so personally into someone who now stood beside him as an ally. For years he had argued in council chambers that peace was fragile, that the enemy never honored its word, but seeing her scars was not strategy or debate, it was proof, living, breathing, undeniable. She moved away from him, crossing the cabin with calm, deliberate steps, as though putting distance between them could erase what had been revealed. He let her go, though every instinct urged him to close the gap, to reach out, to demand more answers. She stopped at the viewport, staring into the dark stretch of space where stars glimmered faint and cold. "I don't tell this to anyone," she said without turning, her voice now quieter, almost fragile, though still wrapped in that unyielding armor of strength. "Not because I fear judgment. I've endured worse than whispers. But because I learned long ago that people look at me differently when they know. They don't see a soldier anymore, or an officer, or even a woman. They see scars. They see damage. They see what was done to me rather than what I am." The Admiral listened, feeling the weight of her words settle on his chest like lead. He understood all too well what she meant, though his own scars had always been the kind that uniforms and medals turned into symbols of valor rather than shame. No one had ever looked at his wounds and seen weakness. For her, the world had not been so merciful. He finally found his voice again, steadier this time. "I don't see you as damage," he said, though he realized as he spoke that words alone would never be enough to convince her. She turned then, her expression unreadable, a flicker of something vulnerable in her eyes before it vanished again behind her practiced calm. "Maybe you mean that now," she said, "but trust me, Admiral, scars change everything. They change how people treat you. They change how you see yourself. And sometimes," her hand brushed briefly across her side almost unconsciously, "they remind you that the war never ended, not really, not for those of us who carry it on our skin. The silence that followed was heavy but not empty. It was the silence of truths shared, of barriers lowered, of two lives intersecting at a fault line neither had expected. And though she had closed her shirt, though the scars were hidden once more, the Admiral knew that nothing between them would ever be quite the same. The Admiral could not rest that night. He remained in his quarters long after she had left, the dim light of his console casting faint shadows against the steel walls, his mind circling the same images over and over. Her calm expression, her bitter smile, and most of all, the scars that ran like cruel inscriptions across her ribs. He had been trained his whole life to read maps, charts, tactical displays, yet now he found himself trying to read the meaning of those marks, to decipher what battles and nights of suffering they represented, to imagine the chains that had bound her and the hands that had done such damage. For hours he tried to force his thoughts elsewhere, fleet reports, intercepted transmissions, logistical requests, but none of them could silence the echo of her words, the ones your fleet escorts through contested space. His stomach tightened at the realization because she was right. Diplomats celebrated treaties while fleets like his were ordered to guard convoys of those same enemies, the same who had burned villages, enslaved prisoners, carved memories into living flesh. Peace, the Admiral said in council, was a fragile dream worth protecting. But was it peace, he wondered, if it demanded forgetting the truth of what had been done? And what kind of commander did that make him if he had looked away for so long? The next morning when she reported to the bridge at her station, she was exactly as she had always been, poised, sharp, disciplined. If he had not seen her scars, he would have believed nothing weighed on her shoulders except duty. She saluted, she issued her reports, she laughed quietly with the younger officers when the moment allowed, and no one suspected that beneath her uniform was a history of suffering written in cruel lines. The Admiral watched her as discreetly as he could, measuring the strength it must take to wear such composure like a second skin. He realized that if the crew ever discovered what she carried, they would revere her more, not less. Yet she was right in a way. Reverence could be another cage, another way of being defined only by pain. So he said nothing, kept her secret as though it were now his own, though his chest burned with the need to do something more than silence. That evening he summoned her again, not to confront but to share. She entered his quarters cautiously, perhaps expecting questions she had no wish to answer. Instead, he poured them both a drink, the amber liquid catching the faint glow of the cabin lights, and offered it to her without ceremony. For a moment she hesitated, then accepted, lowering herself into the chair across from him. Neither spoke for a time. Silence was safer, and both were soldiers who understood the comfort of sitting in quiet. Finally he broke it. "You were right last night," he said quietly. "We call it peace, but what we have is only distance from the fighting. They still carry the war in their hands and people like you still carry it in your bodies." She looked at him sharply, but there was no accusation in his voice, only weariness, the kind that lived in men who had seen too much. Slowly she nodded. "And you," she said, "carry it in your decisions. Every convoy you escort, every treaty you enforce. Different scars, same war." Her words struck him harder than he expected because she was right again. His scars were not carved into his skin but into his conscience. He remembered the orders he had signed, the systems he had abandoned because the council deemed them expendable, the refugees he had turned away because his fleet had no capacity. All those choices weighed no less heavily than the blade or the brand. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing briefly. "Do you hate me for it?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. She blinked, surprised, then shook her head. "If I hated everyone who followed orders, Admiral, there would be no one left to stand beside me. Hate is too heavy. Survival doesn't leave room for it." Her tone was flat, matter-of-fact, but he caught the faint tremor beneath it, the kind of tremor that came from scars that still burned no matter how much time had passed. He wanted to reach across the table, to take her hand, to offer some gesture of solidarity, but she was not asking for comfort, and he knew she would reject pity like poison. Instead, he raised his glass in a small salute. She mirrored him, and they drank in silence, both knowing the words unsaid were heavier than those spoken. Later, when she left his cabin, he remained staring at the empty glass, the taste of the liquor lingering bitter on his tongue. He realized then that he could not remain idle. It wasn't just about her scars, it was about everything they represented, everything he had allowed to pass under the guise of duty. He thought of the younger officers on his ship, the ones who believed the peace was real, who had never seen what he and she had seen. They trusted him to lead them, to protect not only their lives but their sense of purpose. If he kept pretending, if he kept playing the council's game, he would betray not only her but every one of them. The decision formed slowly, like a storm building beyond the horizon, inevitable once it gathered enough force. He would act though he did not yet know how. And when the time came, he knew she would be at the heart of it, because those scars were not only wounds, they were banners, and he could no longer ignore what they demanded of him. The Admiral's resolve hardened in the days that followed, though outwardly nothing about his command seemed to change. The crew still moved briskly through the corridors of the flagship, reports still arrived from the frontiers, and the fleet still executed its patrol routes as though the fragile peace was something solid to defend. Yet beneath the routine was a tension the officers could not name, a weight in the Admiral's eyes when he stood at the command dais and stared too long at the star maps projected above the consoles. He had always carried the air of authority, the calm steadiness of a man who had lived through battles too fierce to be forgotten, but now there was something else, a quiet unrest like a storm gathering in silence. Only she seemed to sense it, perhaps because she herself had lived in the eye of storms too long not to recognize their approach. She said nothing, yet he often caught her watching him from across the bridge, her gaze steady, measuring him as though she knew he was approaching a line from which there would be no return. One night, unable to sleep, he walked the lower decks of the ship where few ever saw him, where the hum of the reactors and the rhythm of machinery filled the silence. He found her there, as though she too had been unable to rest, leaning against a bulkhead with her arms folded, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She didn't seem surprised when he appeared, didn't flinch or stand at attention, only looked at him with a faint, tired recognition. "You're restless," she said, not as an accusation but as a truth observed. He gave a dry smile. "And you aren't." Her lips curved just slightly, the ghost of something that might have been humor in a different life. "Rest is a luxury. For some of us it ended a long time ago." He studied her in the dim light, the lines of her face, the strength in her stance despite the exhaustion etched in her eyes. He wanted to ask again about her scars, about the nights and chains that had left them, but he held the question back. Some truths were not taken, they had to be given. Instead, he spoke of himself, surprising even his own tongue. "I ordered an entire colony abandoned once. The council demanded it. We didn't have the resources to hold it, and the enemy was advancing. I left 10,000 people behind. Families, children. I told myself it was strategy, necessity. But I still hear their voices when I close my eyes." She listened without interruption, her gaze never leaving his, as though she understood that this was not a confession seeking absolution but a burden being set down for the first time. When he finished, silence stretched between them, filled only by the thrum of the ship's engines. Finally she said, "You think your guilt makes you weaker. But it doesn't. It makes you human. What they did to me, what they did to countless others, they wanted us to stop being human. To become nothing but marks on a ledger, slaves in their system. You still feel, Admiral. That's why you can still fight." Her words settled deep within him, more than any speech in the council chambers ever had. He realized then that the scars on her body and the scars on his conscience were not so different. Both were records of a war the world pretended was over. And both demanded something more than silence. He took a slow breath, the decision that had been forming within him taking clearer shape. "If I act," he said quietly, "it will mean defying the council. It will mean putting this entire fleet at risk. And it will mean asking you to stand with me when the consequences come." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you think I've come this far just to stand aside? I've lived my whole life as proof of what happens when people choose safety over truth. If you mean to act, Admiral, I'll be there. But don't ask me if I'm ready to pay the price. I already paid it." For a long moment they simply stood there, two soldiers bound not by rank or duty but by scars, his invisible, hers carved in flesh, each recognizing in the other the same restless refusal to accept the lies of peace. At last he nodded. "Then it begins," he murmured, though he wasn't sure yet what form it would take. She gave a short nod in return, and without another word they walked the length of the corridor together, their steps echoing softly against the steel floor, as though the ship itself bore witness to the silent pact just formed. In the following days the Admiral began subtle moves, small shifts no one would notice unless they looked closely. Patrol routes adjusted slightly to skirt too near contested zones, communications filtered differently through secure channels, supply logs altered just enough to mask the redeployment of resources. It was not rebellion yet, but it was preparation, like drawing a blade slowly from its sheath. And though no one else on the bridge seemed aware, he knew she saw. She always saw. She did not question him, did not confront him, only gave the faintest nods when their eyes met, a silent affirmation that she understood where the path was leading. Together, without saying it aloud, They were steering the fleet toward something far beyond the Council's carefully managed peace. The tension aboard the flagship grew heavier with each passing cycle, though the crew could not name its cause. Orders still came, precise and calm, the Admiral's voice steady over the comms, yet beneath the surface there was an undercurrent, a quiet shift that unsettled even the most disciplined officers. Some whispered that the Admiral was planning something, others dismissed it as fatigue from long months of patrol without action, but none dared ask directly. Only she knew the truth, though she carried it in silence, her expression unchanged, her posture as composed as ever. Yet in her eyes there was a fire that had not been there before, a spark of recognition that she was no longer alone in carrying the weight of scars, visible or unseen. They shared brief glances across the bridge, fleeting moments where trust passed between them like a coded message invisible to all others. Those who noticed thought it nothing more than mutual respect, but in truth it was a bond forged in the space between wounds and choices, a bond now pulling both of them toward a confrontation neither could avoid. The Admiral received his next orders from the Council on the 6th day, and they were as bitter as he had feared. A convoy of enemy diplomats, escorted by mercenary vessels, was to be guided through contested space under his fleet's protection. The official justification was to maintain stability, to show goodwill, to strengthen the fragile peace. But he saw the truth behind the words. It was submission, a gesture of weakness dressed as diplomacy, and worse, it was betrayal of every world and every soldier who had bled in the war. When he read the directive aloud in his quarters, she stood nearby, arms folded, her jaw tightening as the words fell into the stale air between them. "They expect you to guard them?" she asked coldly as though tasting poison on her tongue. He nodded grimly. "Yes. And they expect me to smile while I do it." She shook her head, a quiet fury in her gaze. "They think scars vanish if you hide them. They think history erases itself if you escort its authors with enough ceremony." Her hand drifted unconsciously to her ribs, where the hidden marks lay beneath her uniform. "But they don't vanish. They don't erase." The Admiral walked to the viewport, staring out at the endless dark. "If I obey, I betray everything I've sworn to defend. If I refuse, I risk everything, my command, this fleet, perhaps even the war erupting anew." His voice was low, heavy with the weight of a decision no council chamber could ever fully comprehend. She stepped closer, standing beside him, her reflection faint in the glass. "You already know your answer," she said quietly. He turned, meeting her eyes. "And if my answer drags you down with me?" She held his gaze without flinching. "Then I go down standing, not kneeling. Do you think I fear losing my place in a fleet after everything I've survived? No, Admiral. What I fear is watching us pretend the wounds never happened." Her conviction was absolute, and in that moment he knew the choice had already been made. When the convoy arrived, the fleet moved into position, every ship aligned in precise formation. The bridge was silent except for the hum of systems and the clipped reports of officers following protocol. Outwardly, it was routine, a simple escort mission executed with flawless discipline. Inwardly, the Admiral's mind was a battlefield, weighing risks, timing, possibilities. She stood at her post, calm, watchful, but her fingers rested lightly on the console controls, ready for the unspoken order that might change everything. The enemy ships glided into formation, their sleek hulls gleaming with arrogance, their escorts bristling with weapons the treaty supposedly forbade. The Council's representatives sent a transmission of approval, their voices smug, congratulating the Admiral for his service. He did not respond. Instead, he stared at the tactical display, the pieces on the board arrayed before him like a game in which lives were pawns. Slowly he gave the command, "Hold formation. Do not engage. Maintain position." The officers nodded, unsuspecting. But beneath those simple words, another order waited, unspoken, one that only she understood. Hours passed as the fleet escorted the convoy through hostile sectors. The enemy ships grew bolder, drifting closer to the Admiral's flagship, their signals mocking in their precision as though daring him to react. He remained silent, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the stars. At last, when the fleet reached a stretch of space where communications were unreliable and patrols scarce, he leaned slightly toward her console and spoke in a voice only she could hear. "Now." Her fingers moved instantly, transmitting a coded signal across the fleet's hidden channels, a signal no one else could read. Within seconds, subtle shifts rippled through the formation. Weapon systems primed quietly, shields adjusted, ships repositioned with deceptive grace. The enemy escorts noticed nothing, too confident in the illusion of peace. The Admiral's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at the risk, but his voice when it came was steady, commanding. Target locks on all hostile vessels. Prepare to fire on my mark. The bridge fell silent, officers glancing at each other in confusion, some beginning to realize what was happening. She met his gaze across the consoles, her eyes fierce, unwavering. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still, the stars beyond frozen, the crew holding its collective breath. Then the Admiral gave the order that would change everything. Fire. The first salvo tore through the silence of space with merciless precision, beams of energy lancing from the Admiral's fleet toward the unsuspecting enemy escorts. Explosions blossomed like cruel stars, fire and shrapnel scattering into the void as the sleek vessels crumpled under the sudden onslaught. Alarms shrieked across the bridge, officers shouting in disbelief as the carefully maintained illusion of peace shattered in a heartbeat. Some froze, too stunned to process the betrayal of routine, while others snapped to action, obeying the Admiral's commands without hesitation, loyalty overriding confusion. The Admiral stood tall at the command dais, his eyes cold, his voice steady as steel. Maintain formation. Prioritize escorts. Disable their weapons first, engines second. No survivors among the hostile combatants. His words cut like a blade through the chaos, transforming hesitation into grim purpose. The crew responded, weapons firing in synchronized arcs, shields flaring as the enemy attempted a desperate counterstrike. She moved with flawless efficiency at her console, her hands dancing over the controls as though the battle had been rehearsed. Her calm steadied the officers nearest to her, reminding them that this was no madness but a calculated strike. Still, the weight of what they were doing pressed on every soul aboard. They were not simply fighting enemies, they were defying the Council itself, severing ties with the fragile order imposed upon them. Yet no one dared to speak it aloud. The battle consumed all thought. Enemy ships erupted one after another, their wreckage drifting silently in the darkness. The convoy of diplomats screamed across open channels, demanding explanation, shrieking threats, invoking the treaty. The Admiral ignored them, his gaze fixed on the tactical display. He felt no triumph in their destruction, only a grim inevitability. The time for pretense had ended. But even as victory seemed within their grasp, a shadow loomed larger on the sensors. From the far edge of the system, more signatures appeared, heavy warships, far larger than the escorts, drawn in secretly to watch the convoy's passage. The Council had not known or perhaps had chosen not to see, but the enemy had prepared for betrayal. The Admiral's jaw tightened as the icons multiplied across the display, a dozen warships advancing with deadly precision. The bridge crew gasped, some paling at the sheer scale of the reinforcements. She looked at him, eyes burning with the fire of someone who had lived too long with the knowledge that the enemy always struck hardest when you thought them beaten. They were waiting for this, she said, her voice low but steady. He nodded once. Then we give them what they came for. The clash that followed was unlike any engagement the fleet had faced in years. The enemy warships opened fire with overwhelming force, volleys of plasma tearing into shields, shaking the flagship to its core. Officers clung to their stations as consoles sparked, smoke filling the air, alarms wailing in a cacophony that threatened to drown thought itself. The Admiral's commands cut through it all, precise, relentless, shaping chaos into defiance. Redirect power to forward shields. Squadron 3, flank and strike their rear batteries. All carriers launch fighters now. We do not yield. His voice carried not just authority but conviction, and the crew, hearts pounding, obeyed with renewed determination. She was everywhere at once, coordinating fire, rerouting systems, calling out enemy maneuvers with uncanny foresight. Her scars, hidden beneath the uniform, seemed to pulse with the memory of battles past, driving her forward with a will unbreakable. The first of the enemy warships erupted under concentrated fire, its explosion lighting the void in a brief, furious glare. Cheers broke out across the bridge, cut short as another blast rocked them, sending officers tumbling to the deck. The Admiral gripped the rail, refusing to falter. Pain seared his side where debris had struck, but he stood unyielding. Across from him, she rose from where she had been thrown against her console, blood streaking her temple but eyes burning brighter than ever. Their gazes met, and without words they reminded each other why they fought, not for treaties, not for council decrees, but for every wound carved into the flesh of the living, for every voice silenced in the name of false peace. The battle raged for hours, time dissolving into a blur of fire and fury. Ships burned, allies and enemies alike falling into the abyss, their wreckage scattering across the endless night. By the time the last enemy vessel broke formation and attempted retreat, The Admiral's fleet was battered, half its ships crippled, its fighters reduced to desperate remnants. Yet they still stood, defiant, bleeding but unbroken. "Pursue," the Admiral ordered, his voice hoarse but firm. "No one escapes to carry word of this." The remaining warships surged forward, unleashing one final barrage that shattered the fleeing enemy into fragments of glowing debris. Silence followed at last, a silence so complete it seemed the stars themselves held their breath. On the bridge, officers slumped in exhaustion, some weeping quietly, others staring at their consoles as though unable to believe what they had survived. The Admiral looked around at them, pride and sorrow mingling in his chest. They had crossed the line with him, and nothing would ever return to what it had been. He turned his gaze to her, standing battered but unbowed at her station, blood drying on her cheek, her shoulders squared as though daring the universe to strike again. She met his eyes, and in that look there was no regret, only the fierce acknowledgement that they had chosen truth over illusion. The Council would call them traitors, rebels, criminals. Perhaps they would even be hunted by the very worlds they had once sworn to protect. But none of that mattered now. They had carved their own path, and though the stars ahead were uncertain, they would face them together. The airfield was chaos. Mechanics ran from one aircraft to another, carrying tools, oxygen tanks and fuel hoses, their faces streaked with grease and sweat. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, warning that enemy bombers were still circling beyond the coast. Yet in the middle of this frenzy, one figure moved with calm determination, Captain Evelyn Grant. Her flight suit still bore the dust and oil stains from the last mission, but her posture was unshaken. Pilots who had once doubted her now looked at her with something close to awe. They had seen her rise into the sky when everyone else hesitated, and they had seen how her courage turned fear into resolve. The nickname whispered by the younger crew, Iron Wings, had begun to spread across the base like wildfire, and though Evelyn pretended not to notice, it gave her a hidden strength. She knew the war was far from over, but each victory mattered, each flight carried the weight of hundreds of lives. Orders soon came down from command. More bombers were detected heading inland, escorted by enemy fighters this time. The brass wanted an immediate counterstrike. Evelyn gathered her small squadron, her eyes meeting each of theirs. She didn't deliver grand speeches, only a quiet, steady reminder. Stay sharp, trust your training, and remember, we're not just defending the skies, we're defending home. The men nodded, and for the first time, none of them hesitated at the idea of following her lead. The engines roared to life, their vibrations rumbling through the ground, and Evelyn's P-38 Lightning rolled onto the runway with the grace of a predator ready to hunt. Dust and smoke swirled behind the wheels as she pushed the throttle forward, the aircraft leaping into the air like it was born to defy gravity. She felt the G-forces press against her chest again, that familiar trial her superiors had claimed she was too weak to endure, but she gritted her teeth and held firm. Every beat of her heart pumped steel into her veins. The sky was a storm of sunlight and shadows as the squadron climbed higher. In the distance, the black dots of enemy bombers grew larger, their massive frames flanked by darting fighter escorts. Evelyn quickly assessed the situation. The enemy fighters outnumbered them nearly 2-1, but she refused to let fear take root. She issued crisp commands over the radio, her voice steady. 2 wings break right, cut them off. I'll lead the center run. Her plane sliced through the air, sunlight glinting off the metal. The first clash came fast, a swarm of enemy fighters diving to intercept. Bullets streaked across the sky like angry wasps, tracer fire zipping past her canopy. Evelyn rolled hard, pulling her plane into a sharp climb, forcing the pursuers into a difficult angle. She flipped the Lightning upside down and cut into a dive, her gun spitting fire. The enemy aircraft burst into flames, spiraling down in a trail of smoke. Her squadron fought valiantly, but the numbers were brutal. Evelyn's radio crackled with shouts, calls for help, confirmations of kills, and the gut-wrenching silence of voices that went unanswered. She forced herself to push on, weaving through chaos with precision. The bombers loomed larger now, massive shadows blotting out the sun as they approached the coastline. Their payloads, if dropped, would devastate Los Angeles and its surrounding areas. Evelyn's mind sharpened. She had no choice but to break through. Pushing her engines to the limit, she darted between enemy fighters, the Lightning trembling under the strain. Bullets riddled her wings, one round shattering her left mirror, but she pressed forward. With a squeeze of the trigger, her cannons roared, tearing into the side of a bomber. The explosion was deafening, a fiery blossom that shook the formation. But one bomber slipping through was enough to bring disaster, and Evelyn knew it. She pulled her plane into a daring climb, G-forces crushing her into the seat, the sky narrowing into black around her vision. Her breath came in ragged bursts, but she forced her body to endure. At the peak of her climb, she flipped the plane into a dive straight at the lead bomber. Every instinct screamed at her to pull away. Her speed was too high, her margin for error too thin, but she ignored it. At the last possible second, she fired a full volley. The rounds slammed into the bomber's cockpit and engines, ripping it apart in a thunderous blast. Evelyn yanked her stick back, the lightning groaning as it clawed upward, skimming past the fireball by a hair's breadth. The surviving bombers began to scatter, their escorts retreating under the relentless assault of Evelyn's squadron. Smoke trails and flaming wreckage filled the sky, the battle painting its brutal story across the heavens. Evelyn's breath finally steadied as the last enemy plane broke away, limping toward the horizon. Over the radio, the surviving pilots cheered, their voices hoarse but triumphant. They had done it, they had protected the city again. Evelyn allowed herself the smallest of smiles, though her hands still trembled on the controls. She knew the cost had been heavy, but she also knew this was only one chapter in a much larger war. As her squadron turned back toward the base, the Pacific stretched beneath them, calm and indifferent, hiding the battles that raged above. Evelyn glanced down at the coastline, imagining families gathered in safety, children playing unaware of the destruction that might have rained upon them. That thought alone fueled her determination. She whispered to herself, a vow carried by the wind, "As long as I can fly, they'll never touch this land." Her lightning descended with the squadron, battered but unbroken, a symbol of defiance in a war that tested every ounce of human endurance. The sky had demanded everything of her, but once again, Evelyn had given it more. The city of Los Angeles was still in shock from the devastation the bombers had caused, even though they were ultimately destroyed. The smell of smoke hung in the air, buildings were damaged and the streets were littered with shattered glass and twisted metal. Rescue workers moved quickly, pulling survivors from the wreckage and helping families reunite. But amidst the chaos, whispers spread about the pilot who had saved them all. People asked each other, "Did you hear about the woman who flew that jet? They said she was too weak for G-forces, but she's the one who shot down the bombers." Some dismissed it as rumor, others swore they saw it with their own eyes, but soon the truth began to spread like wildfire. Evelyn, the woman who had been told she could never fly combat missions, was the reason Los Angeles was still standing. Military officials, however, were not celebrating in the same way. Inside a heavily guarded briefing room, commanders pored over radar data, mission logs, and pilot reports. General Harris, a stern man with a clipped voice, slammed his hand on the table. "This is unacceptable." She disobeyed orders, took an experimental aircraft without authorization, and engaged enemy forces. If she had failed, we'd be standing in the ashes of this city. Do you all realize that? But another officer countered, "Sir, with all due respect, if she hadn't acted, we would already be in the ashes." Her disobedience saved millions of lives. The room went silent. The general's face tightened as he weighed the truth. Rules had been broken, yes, but heroes were not forged by rules, they were forged by results. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat quietly in a dimly lit hangar, still wearing her flight suit. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming adrenaline that had yet to fade. The jet she had flown, scorched and dented from combat, rested behind her like a wounded beast. She ran her fingers along its surface, whispering a soft thank you to the machine that had carried her through the storm. A young mechanic approached, eyes wide with admiration. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, what you did up there, it was incredible. You saved my family. My mother lives downtown. If those bombs had hit," his voice cracked and Evelyn placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Then I'm glad I was there," she said quietly. It wasn't glory she sought, it was simply the knowledge that she had done what needed to be done. That night, news reports exploded across every channel. Headlines blared, "Mystery pilot saves Los Angeles." Videos captured shaky footage of the dogfight, her lone jet darting through the skies, weaving between streams of tracer fire, and unleashing missiles that tore enemy bombers apart. The world now knew her name. Children looked at her picture with awe, veterans saluted when they saw her, and politicians scrambled to claim her victory as a symbol of resilience. But for Evelyn, fame was nothing but noise. She thought only of the moment she saw the city below her, still standing, still alive, and of the silence she felt when the last bomber went down. That silence was worth more than medals or parades. Still, consequences awaited her. She was summoned to face a panel of military judges the following morning. The chamber was austere, filled with high-ranking officials whose expressions revealed nothing. The lead officer read the charges: unauthorized use of military property, disobedience of direct orders, reckless endangerment of national assets. Each word cut like a blade. But then came the final line: and in recognition of extraordinary heroism under fire, saving the lives of millions, this tribunal recommends her actions be reviewed under the Extraordinary Exceptions Clause. Evelyn stood tall, refusing to flinch. Whatever their decision, she knew the truth: she had done what no one else dared to do. When the session ended, she walked outside to find a crowd waiting beyond the barricades. Civilians, soldiers, children, and elders all stood together, chanting her name. They cheered not just for a hero, but for proof that courage could rise from the most unexpected places. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. She was never supposed to be here. She was told she was too fragile, too weak, too unfit. Yet here she stood, alive, victorious, and stronger than ever. That night, as the city lights shimmered against the darkened sky, Evelyn found herself on the rooftop of a hospital where many survivors were being treated. She gazed upward, her heart heavy with memories of the battle. She whispered to the stars, "I wasn't supposed to make it. But I did." And in that moment she realized something profound. Her story was no longer just her own. It belonged to every person who had ever been told they couldn't, every soul who had been underestimated, every dreamer who had been silenced. She had proved them wrong, not with words but with fire and steel in the skies. The war was not over. More enemies would come, more battles would be fought, and more lives would hang in the balance. But Evelyn was ready. She had already faced the impossible and won. And from this day forward, whenever someone whispered, "too weak for G-forces," the world would remember the woman who had taken flight and saved a city from destruction. Evelyn was no longer just a pilot. She was a symbol of defiance, a living legend whose courage burned brighter than the bombs that sought to destroy everything. Emma ki kahani abus mor pare gai ti jahan har sans ek imdahin ti, har lama ek jang ti, or har faisla uski liya ne mushkilat lakare rahada. Los Angeles kuyupar ka osman biduan orag ki party esi gaira. The Japanese bombers ka silsila ubitak rukan ka nam nahi la rahada, or American Faji pilots ki the ken unk charan esi zahir ho rahiti. Emma kujet any ab kai gant hawa main gazare, or uski ankan lail ho chuki ti, lekin uski jazbi ka rang ubi bitazada. Control tower esi bar use kal kia jaraha the kuwo neche aa kar aram care, lekin Emma ka jawab hamesha wohi the jab tak shihar zinda hai mainbi zinda rahungi. Uski jet ka fuel cam ho rahada, or ammo be surf kuch high bombs or bullets bachi ti, lekin uska irada pathar seb zayada mazbutta. Usan sosha, agar main neche gai to agla shakar shaya jishi ma ka beta, jishi baki ka bap, ya jishi bujurg ka sahara ban jayaga, or ya emma kabi bardash nahi kar sakti ti. Dushman planes ka ek or tufan samundar ki tarafasi dai kai dia, is dafa unka formation giada mazbut or planning giada tekakat se baratha. Emma any turant apna radio activate kia or baki pilots ko bola, sablog mare pichiao formation tight rako. Abwo surfek pilot nahi rahi ti, wo leader ban chuki ti, jisan surf apni house lay se puri team ko joshua banayatha. Jab Japanese bombers any Los Angeles par se bombs jarana shurukai, Emma any unk beach isagus car attack kia jays haweo ka tufan. Usan peli bomber ku engine ko target kia, ferdusser ka tail blast car dia, or tisra to uski goli chalain kia was sun car high control ko batha or samundar main gurgaya. Har blast kubad Emma kudil main surfek high sok ti, mir log mafaz ren shahi. Lekin dushman be Emma ki himat ko samaj gaya the. Ek Japanese ace pilot, jo apni skills or brutal tactics ki waja se mashor the, usan Emma ko target banaya. Wo Emma kujet kuyupar aa gaya, uski golian hawa ko chak kardi hui uski bilkul pas se guzri. Cockpit kashish par scratches aa gay, or ek bullet uski shoulder kupas se guzri, jiska dardasan Mrs. Kia, lekin wo cheek binahi. Usan apna jet alta karka neche gamaya, or dushman pilot uski piche chipak gaya. Yaik maut ka dance the jahan zara si galti dano main se jishi ka ant ban sakti ti. Neche samundar ka pani chamak raha the upar osman main sholan or duwan the, or beach main surf do fighters. Ek apni watan kuliya dusra apni hukum kuliya. Emma any apni training ko yad kia, jo kabias and secret practice sessions main hazel ki ti. Usan apni jet ko ek dam se sita upar kinch liya, or fur engine ki speed cam karka neche dive kia. Japanese ace samaja ko Emma any control ko dia high, wobi piche neche aya, lekanema eni bilkul last second par apni jet ko sharp angle par mod karuski piche jalia. Abwo shikari t or dushman shikar. Ek lam manus apna trigger daba dia, or golian dushman ko cockpit ko cheer gai. Uska jet jalta hua samundar main jajira, or hawa main bs ek shore the jojik ki nishani the. Lekanema kaliya ya surf ek or shikar nahi the, ya ek sabut the ku wo surf hawa ki galami nahi kardi, wo uski malka hai. Los Angeles kuneche log use dek kar cheer karn lage, bachi jahan bombs gur rahi the wahan bi look she saved us. Kate hu use salute karn lage. Radio stations any turant uski bear main report karni shuru ki, or newspapers any headline benai, the girl who defended the skies. Lekanema apni cockpit main akili by tt, uski hamp p ek chodi asai muskan t, or dil main ek hai kyle, yes surf shuruat hai. Usan sosha, jang ubi kadam nahi hui, or shayad kl use dobara inhi haweo main ladna paid. Lekan abwo akili nahi t, abuski piche ek kam ka jazba the, ek shihar ka pyar or ek mulk ka 8 bear the. Control tower esya kri kalaya, Emma you're a hero. Come home. Usan halka essay radio dabaya or jawab dia, main gartab ongi jab asman bilkul safe haga. Or furasan apna jet dobara hawa main athea, jays kukach rahi ho, jab tak main zinda hoon Los Angeles par kabi and hira nahi chega. The end.